Hey, it's me, Rose la Fabiloca, and we are going to take down white supremacy, one pendejo at a time. This is the Sabe podcast.
Hello everyone, welcome back to the Sabe podcast where we discuss social, political, and economic issues facing minorities in the present day. I hope you all enjoyed episode 12 where we discuss marijuana and its races as history. If you haven't yet, please give it a listen and let me know what your thoughts are. Don't forget to subscribe and share if you care as we address these world issues one pendejo at a time. So today we're going to be talking about a very controversial topic. In my brainstorming about what kind of episodes I wanted to build this podcast around, I have to admit this was something that came up in my head that I really wanted to talk about. And then I shied away from it because I know how controversial my examples of it would be for those who are related to me. But then I had a really specific kind of conversation with one of my closest friends on my birthday where she was discussing an extended family member of hers and their complicated relationship. And it just brought me back to this topic, and I felt like, you know what? Fuck it, because this really needs to be said. People really need to wake up and have a wake-up call about how they treat others and how that widely accepted mistreatment becomes the very seed that's planted into us young, that grows into an adult that suffers from mental illnesses. And because this podcast is really supposed to be brutally honest and real and something that gives insight to outsiders about minority groups, I felt like, well, how can you have this conversation and how can you approach it in the best way possible? How can you make it impactful? And all I got in my head as a response to myself was just elevate the conversation. So that's what I decided to do. This isn't meant to be some source of gossip or unnecessary drama or criticism. This is me showing people just one of the many social issues Hispanics have faced and are facing today within our own community. And a lot of this is due to lack of education. Education is everything because when you know better, you do better. And the more educated you are, the better and healthier relationships have the potential to be because you will begin to develop tools to handle your problems with people better. Now, some people in my inner circle would be very familiar with some of these stories and examples, and that is why I felt the need to look back on the dialogues that I've had with those people. And while they completely connected deeply to what I was saying, I can look back and feel like in those instances, I came from a place of bitterness and not education and elevation. So that's what my aim is today, and I might fall short because some topics just don't have the perfect way to talk about them because they just don't get talked about enough to come to a place where they've been perfected. But I think I'm at peace with what I've journaled about this topic. So for those of you who may not be minorities, or even more specifically, may not be considered a person of color or a person of color with newly immigrated families, I'm hoping that you can get a new perspective of some of the day-to-day things that we deal with and why it's so important for minorities like African American people to have access to equal healthcare, because there are some serious deep-rooted traumas that come along with being a human living in a marginalized group in the US. And it's not to say that white people don't have toxic relationships or experience toxic relationships within their families, but it's just that if you take that, the having toxic relationships with family and add the layer of the experience of being a person of color and being newly emigrated to this country, it's this extra burden placed upon your life that you have to grapple with every single day. Now you might be thinking, what does having toxic family have to do with the minority experience? And what the heck does it have to do with immigration? Well, you see, when you are a bicultural person, meaning, for example, I am Hispanic, but I was born in Queens, New York, which makes me American, right? When you are bicultural like that, you are constantly trying to balance between these two very different cultures, the American one and the Hispanic one. And if you're like me, some of my family members have just moved within the United States in comparison to other Hispanic families. For example, on my dad's side of the family, the Puerto Rican side, he has 7 brothers and sisters, and the older half siblings were born in Puerto Rico, and he, being the second to youngest sibling, was born in Connecticut. So on my mother's side of the family, the Dominican side, she was born in the Dominican Republic and moved to the Bronx as a toddler. So generally speaking, the majority of my parents' generation in their families were born and raised in their respective islands. So technically, their children are first generation born Americans. So even though my parents are very Americanized in a lot of ways because they spend most of their upbringing in the States, there's still a lot about them and their parents and their siblings that I can see is very Dominican centric or Puerto Rican centric. So as far as purely American born kids go, I consider my sister, cousins, and I to be consistently across the board the first American-born generation in our family tree, despite the fact that both of my parents were raised here for the majority of their lives. So this is a really significant position to be in when we talk about family trees. The generation to first emigrate to a country comes with their own sets of issues in America. For example, learning the language. My father had a delay in speaking English despite being born in Connecticut because even though he grew up in the Bronx, Hispanics were still living and raising their kids more or less with the mentalities that they had on the island and with the culture and traditions they had on the island, which one of those things is Spanish, speaking Spanish. And in fact, his mother, she didn't speak any English at all, and his father speaks English, but it's not perfect, obviously, it's obviously not his native language. And another issue is assimilation, and no one comes to America knowing how to assimilate. That's a process that takes time. You have to see how people conduct themselves, what in that society you can and can't get away with as a minority. Especially in the 80s, being a person of color at that time was a daily battle. People were strong with their prejudices regarding racism, colorism, and xenophobia. And on top of those two reasons, there was also a lack of educational opportunities. My parents have 2 very contrast childhood stories. On the one hand, my father grew up poverty-stricken. His entire family moved around a lot because of this, and they married young in order to get out of the house and try to build their own lives. And some of them went to school, some didn't. Some went to school later on, not necessarily right after high school. Some went to the military and then settled down young. When you are popping out 2 and 3 kids at a young age, there's not a lot of time as a Hispanic woman and as a Hispanic couple in the 80s and 90s to pursue your wildest dreams. This was a generation on my father's side of the family that was focused on getting out of their poverty realities and into the American dream. And this didn't happen overnight. It took a lot of building, sacrifice, and helping each other in times of need, which they have all gone through. And my parents' generation was a generation of hard workers. I mean, they really busted their ass to make sure that they could make something of themselves. And it really speaks to the fact that, in that instance, being a first-generation born American kid, we had privileges that they never got to have. And even I would challenge you guys that have this issue that I'm going to get into more. I would challenge you guys to think of it from the perspective of the fact that our parents didn't really get the opportunity or privilege, I should say, to go on journeys of self-discovery, introspection, and adventure. They didn't often have time, money, and circumstances to travel and expand their minds. And on top of that, they grew up eating very poor diets, which has led many of them to suffer from health issues. And some of these medications that they have been on for many decades to address their health issues has impacted their mental health and induced depression and crippling anxiety into their lives. And while it's not our job to fix them or sift through their issues or deal with them, you don't have to deal with them if they're toxic family members. You're not forced. There's no contract. There's no blood promise that you have to deal with them. But what you should do is look at their circumstances and understand their intentions and who they are, And you will be at much more peace with yourself and be able to shed and unlearn some of the toxic mentalities and behaviors that you've been socialized to think of from a very young age. And I know that that's been a process for me. It took me cutting off those family members and just severing those ties. And then it took me time to go on that journey of self-discovery, go on that journey of education, of just getting information about psychology and how, different generations have suffered from different traumas mentally and physically, etc. And so I've come to this place where, although I have no interest in having a relationship with these people, I can understand where they're coming from. And that helps me, in turn, check myself to make sure that I'm not perpetuating or continuing those generational curses. And when we do this beautiful shedding of these generational curses and uncover these layers that we have been avoiding as a community for so long, a beautiful thing really happens where we shift in our mental state, and we come into this place where we take more accountability and responsibility in how we treat other people. Like the relationship that I have with my niece and nephews, and the relationship that we're going to have even when they're older, is going to be completely night and day from the relationship that I have, or don't have, I should say, with my uncles and aunts, So that comes from the ability of using the privilege that I've had to have education, to know better, to see the statistics, to see how our community has been impacted by the government, by other racial groups, by just simply being Hispanic. These people were a victim of their generation. And it's not to say that they should have no accountability, but it's important as a person who knows better to not carry those burdens and do your part to break those mentalities. And that even plays a part in things like, how the Black Lives Matter movement is having is inciting these conversations about colorism in our community. And even the fact that we're having these young Hispanics talking about colorism and their experiences and being honest about it and saying, hey, like this is how this has affected me my entire life, and it's caused me to feel this way about myself, and we need to stop doing that shit because it hurts, it's toxic, it's not helping. Calling me negrita is not something that I feel like is a compliment, because I feel like you're marginalizing my Afrocentric features instead of praising them. Or when people say, I don't want to be called gordita, I think that it's rude to call me fat girl. Like, I don't want to be called little fat girl. I think that makes me feel some type of way about my relationship with my body. Like, these kinds of conversations are so important because they make a shift happen. Because you may not be able to convince the older generation to make a shift or a change, but what you will do is take responsibility of yourself and your words, and from there builds up these more positive relationships with younger generations. And I think that in of itself is such a beautiful part of the human experience, that we are able to learn, adapt on a constant basis. We are constantly shifting as a whole. And I think that social media has made that even more plausible and even done on a faster speed. Now, let's get into my mother's experience, because her experience was polar opposite of my father's in a lot of ways. So my maternal grandmother fled the Dominican Republic at about 21, 22 years old with my then 2-year-old mother. And her oldest brother, my grandmother's oldest brother, was able to really help her find her way, because he had been living in the States for a little bit prior to that point. And eventually she had 2 more kids, and she also married an Irishman who worked as a cop for the NYPD. And this kind of relationship nurtured the ability for her to live a more middle-class lifestyle back in that era. So my mother was by no means a rich kid, but in comparison to her peers at that time living in the Bronx, she had the ability to come by a lot more opportunities and possibilities for her life than they did. And if you're strictly just comparing them on paper, she had a lot more privilege than they did, because she was more in proximity to that white privilege, being that her stepfather was an Irishman that worked for the NYPD. So naturally, having that educational foundation that was nurtured by going to private schools, my mom has a master's degree, and I bet she probably will get her PhD in the next 5 years. So my father, on the other hand, graduated high school and dabbled in some college, but he doesn't have a degree. Instead, he is, well, honestly, as a kid, I used to just label him as a carpenter. But the reality is that that title doesn't really speak to his abilities. If I were to equate my father's skills in carpentry and remodeling, I would say he has a far greater education than a PhD in that field of study. And that came with hard work, dedication, discipline, and ambition that was bred from his humble beginnings. So these are two very different upbringings in just the context of my house, but these stories vary so much from Hispanic family to Hispanic family. A lot of Mexicans that I know come from families that have been living in the United States for over 100 years. So some of them have always been here and some of them haven't. And the ones that have always been here have been here for literal centuries. And with that kind of array of experiences comes the impact of being first generation born American. My sisters and I are American through and through, meaning we don't know anything other than America. And while I can say the same for my parents, I can't say the same about their siblings, my extended family, because that hasn't been the case for all of them. My mom's father's side of the family still lives in the Dominican Republic, and they're all there, and they've always been there. Whereas my mom's maternal side of the family tends to go back and forth between Dominican Republic and America. So she had a very ethnic upbringing that I didn't necessarily have because I was a first generation born American. So I think a lot of times people see Hispanic immigrant families in America and they just assume they either had all of their kids in that country and then lugged them here, or they assumed the kids were all born here. But the reality is the immigration experience in America is far from how the media paints it to be. Imagine a couple who ended up having 8 kids had about half of them in Puerto Rico and the other half in America. That's a really big contrast to experiences, and I think it really shows the nature of immigration. That people have their reasons for coming here, and we shouldn't be so afraid of the idea of people coming to our country to want a better life. Wanting a better life means being willing to sacrifice for it. Do you guys think people risk their lives and their kids' lives to come here so they can live off of the government? Our government doesn't even take care of its own citizens. So that should say something. People come here because they're already hard workers, but they want to see a bigger return on that. You can work yourself to the bone in the Dominican Republic and make a little money, or you can work yourself to the bone in America and make a lot more money. So naturally, what would you pick? So while there's that foundation to build upon, I want to really get into what the implications are that come with being an immigrant / person of color / black person in relation to family. Because we have these varying immigration experiences, that means that there are certain mentalities of some individuals that believe they and others should act a certain way. And then when you couple that with their American experiences and the American time period they were born in, you create these people that don't believe mental health is a thing for regular people, and they by and large believe that mental illness and discussing mental health is for people who are either crazy or too weak-minded to handle life the way they do or the way they think they do. And B, they glorify the idea of being upset with something and letting it stay shitty because they have a belief system oftentimes that just has the idea of, well, that's the way the cookie crumbles. They find that a lot of millennials feel passionate about things in vain and that we take too many things seriously, causing us to not only waste our time, according to them, but that we have a hard time having a sense of humor about things, which is so fucking weird to me because I feel like we make jokes of literally everything. But all of these reasons come down to one simple thing. Each racial and ethnic group that deals with toxic relationships with family, meaning relationships that have no respect, boundaries, and healthy communication, each group deals with this toxicity for different reasons. For the Hispanic community, we exist in a patriarch society, and granted, technically any American or person in any country always has that looming patriarchy present, but for Hispanics, it's a little bit different and a lot more intense. You see, a big portion of the men in our community have been raised in the same hyper-masculine manner that the Black community suffers from as well. On top of that, in the context of my mother's generation and beyond, many of the women were stay-at-home mothers for a large part of their lives, and some, even still to this day, don't work. So we are often raised by the traditional expectations that predated our parents. On top of that, due to the colonization by the Spaniards, most Hispanic countries still practice the Catholic religion and believe that biblically men are to be the leaders in the family. So we have a lot of different variables playing out just in our countries of origin, but then when you get to the American layer, it complicates things even further. For context, when Hispanic people immigrated here in a large part of the 60s, they were not given a warm welcome, to say the least. The country was extremely xenophobic in nature, and in an era of segregation, it was hard for Hispanics to find their place in society, so to speak. They went through a lot of shared experiences with the African Americans, especially the Mexicans, but they didn't quite fit in with the Black community either. So as far as American Hispanics are concerned, you are socialized young to believe that the family unit is the backbone to your life. And with that idea firmly in place comes the difficulties and complexities of your relationships with literally everyone around you. And this is where we intersect in another area with the Black community. You see, when you belong to an ethnic group that is marginalized, you end up having to rely on your community for any support you might need. And when a community isolates themselves to that degree, you become heavily dependent on your network. And who is the network for newly arrived immigrants and or people who are outcasted by the majority? Family. Family is the network. And for Hispanics, we tend to have a lot of children at that. So that saying, it takes a village to raise a child, is absolutely fucking true. Now, in talking about this topic with my Black friends, a lot of them believe that their toxic tethering to their family members stems from segregation and even slavery, where Black people heavily depended on the support of their community and family in order to keep a family unit together. And I had a really great example of this given to me by a friend. So she said that a relative of hers was molested since the age of 7 by another relative. And unfortunately, that relative of hers never really got the justice she deserves out of that situation and just had to learn to live with her past and deal with the fallout that comes of it. And what was really heartbreaking to hear was that the young woman had told her mother almost immediately after this abuse started happening. And her mother told her, well, that's your uncle and we can't say anything because if we report to the police, they will lock him up. She was made to feel like, despite being the victim of this ongoing abuse, she couldn't just seek justice for herself because her uncle was a Black man, and the American justice system comes down on them much harder than they do anyone else. So to report him would be like a betrayal to the community. So when we talk about mass incarceration, sexual abuse, toxic family connections, and what it's like to be a part of a marginalized group of people, this type of topic is one of the smaller subcategories of that. This topic is a social after effect of what happens when a community is pushed within. So the young girl had to live with that period of her life when her uncle was present and abusing her, and walked away from that childhood experience believing that even at her own expense to her body and mental health and overall well-being, that Black men had to be protected at all costs. And in that instance, that's a community expecting the victim, who is a child, to be the bigger person in a situation with an adult. And that kind of issue is just so rampant in all these communities. And this is something that's in the Hispanic and African communities, but also in other underrepresented communities like Asians and Middle Eastern people. Sexual abuse and overall violence against women is heightened in countries in the Middle East and even in other developing countries in Latino America. Being a woman already puts you in danger, but being a woman in a marginalized group in society, no matter what the country is, puts you at even more risk. Now, regardless of what your specific family story is of how they got here and when they got here, what we do know and what research has proven is that there are indeed family patterns within the Hispanic community between first generation, meaning foreign-born people, second generation, native-born foreign parentage, and third or higher generations, native-born native parentage, that shed a light on the trials and tribulations of assimilation with respect to family patterns. The reality from all this investigation is this: when a group of people emigrated to a place like America,
those offspring will eventually become adults and possibly marry and have kids, right? Well, a clear indication of assimilation for a community in a new country is interracial marriage. It's said that interracial marriage is a dominant form of assimilation because as two different communities come together and have children, those children will be less likely to identify as just one race and rather present themselves as mixed. Hispanics mixing with other races ultimately leads to the blur of racial ethnic boundaries. And this idea has been taken and perverted within the Hispanic community in the saying, mejorar a la raza, meaning improving their race by mixing with the dominant race. In this planet's case, that means white people. So Hispanic families love when their sons and daughters bring home white girlfriends and boyfriends because whether conscious or unconscious, Hispanic parents want a future to be secured for their children and future generations. And in America, being with a white person is considered the way out of poverty and negative circumstances. Now, on the other side of that coin is the fact that Hispanics that marry other Hispanics strengthen that ethnic background when it comes to cultures, traditions, and child rearing. You see, the story of my parents is just one possibility of how a Hispanic kid might be raised in this country. There are other Hispanic kids my age who were raised by one white parent and one Hispanic parent, or one black parent and one Hispanic parent. And all of these different variations speak volumes to how they have experienced relationships within that ethnic group and how that has affected their mental health to this day. And this is the type of dialogue I wish we'd focus on when we talk about immigration, because this reality gets knee-deep into some issues that need to be addressed in how Hispanic Americans are treated in this country when it's the country they were born and raised in. It's one part of the struggle where we don't intersect with the African Americans because the majority, meaning white people, don't question the citizenship as much of Black Americans due to their background with enslavement here. But when we talk about Hispanics, Middle Eastern, Asians, etc., this is where the xenophobic layer creeps into our existence in this American space and where we tend to turn inward into our family and community for support. But this heavy dependence on family ties for survival can often leave a complete disregard to learning what healthy relationships are and how to even have them. It's been studied and proven that Hispanics exhibit high levels of familism relative to non-Hispanics on a variety of structural and demographic indicators. But even within our own community comes the complexity of our nuances because while Hispanics as a whole are showing signs of blurring ethnic and racial boundaries, the longer they live in America, we have groups like Mexicans who are within and whose population stands out for its high level of ethnic endogamy in marriage, cohabitation, and parenthood. And you might say, well, why is that? It goes back to why the Black community for a very long time only married other Black people, because in a society where you're outcasted as a racial group, you turn inward into your community and family. And if we look at the way Mexicans are treated in this country, not only by all racial groups in this country, but also by their own Hispanic peers. For example, I've referenced this in previous podcast episodes that Puerto Rican people, being that Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory, feel a disconnect or distance oftentimes to the plight of Mexican immigrants that come through the border because they are privileged with automatic citizenship to the U.S. that Mexico doesn't have. So it makes a lot of sense that as a whole, Mexicans tend to marry other Mexicans because why? Well, I've always felt personally, and this is just my opinion, I've always felt personally that if I ever did marry and have kids with a Hispanic man, it was probably going to be because of familiarity and comfort. Generally speaking, when you marry someone who is from the same ethnic background as you are, there are a lot of things you don't have to explain because they just get it. They get the culture and the weird shit you guys do because they come from the same line of mentality and struggle. When you marry and have kids with people from other groups, you're learning a bunch of new information about how they operate, and one of the biggest indicators of how they approach life is through the family lens. For example, have you ever heard people talk about how white people often aren't close with their family members? Like, maybe this is just a conversation that happens within like minority communities, but to white people, just to let y'all know, we feel like you guys are not close with your family members. And I feel like every time I tell white people that, they're like, what are you talking about? I love my family. But y'all don't be displaying that the way that we do. Like, we're extra as fuck about it. Like, to us Hispanics, we tend to have homes that are minutes away or even in the same neighborhood, or
if you're really Hispanic, you live in your parents' house and you just live there forever until they die. Because we depend so heavily on the support of one another that we don't like the idea of living 1,500 miles away from each other. We need to know that someone is there. Whereas white people see most of their family like once a year during the holidays and then maybe have casual conversation that's ongoing throughout the year. But in Hispanic culture, there are many ways to which we keep the bond going strong. For example, I'm sure you've also heard jokes about how Hispanics will find any reason to throw a party. And it's because, one, we love food and food brings people together. Two, if we have parties or for birthdays, holidays, graduations, meet the new boyfriend party, quinceañeras, I got a new dog party, or I just feel like having a party, and everyone, all 100 people in the family decide that they're going to live that way, then that means that people are going to be getting together multiple times a month in celebration for whatever event they made up that month. Like, when you think about how little time you actually have in the week to spend time socializing, let's say the average American works 5 days a week with the 2-day weekend, right? Hispanics often pick at least 1 day of the week to be for family. That means they really only get 1 day off to do everything they need to do as an adult to keep their home running. And it also means they choose to spend their extra time with family instead of with friends or alone. This kind of dynamic is something that I see starting to shift in the millennial generation, who really seem to be doing a lot of introspection, turning inward to find deeper meaning to the human experience through the social impact of social media, and thus they're looking at the way they were raised and the influences around them and saying, how the fuck did my parents think it was okay to raise me around these fucking people? Now, granted, there are plenty of exceptions to all this, right? There are white people who adore their family and see them all the time. There are Hispanics that don't come from toxic families, but there is something to be said for the amount of overlap that happens within our community in the context of our relationships with our family. So the point has been made already about the why behind why we tend to depend so heavily on the family unit, but let's get into how this affects us and how this glorification of the family unit is actually detrimental to a lot of Hispanics' overall well-being. I'm going to use the example of a friend of mine. She got pregnant and only told her parents, and her fiance only told his parents. Her mother was so overcome with excitement that she spilled the habichuelas to an aunt of hers prematurely before she was ready to tell any additional people. Well, this particular aunt in that family, it turns out, is one of the worst people her mother could have chosen to tell this news to because she is known to have a big mouth. Now, it's important to know that the girl and her aunt already have a rocky relationship. They don't enjoy each other's company and they don't get along. When they're at family events, they avoid each other as much as possible, and when they do see each other, they're forcing themselves to be cordial. And this poor relationship stems from this aunt really having depression all of her life and not ever seeking clinical help because she doesn't believe in all of that kind of stuff. She don't believe in therapy. Well, because this aunt refuses to acknowledge that depression exists, this depression comes out in her interactions with people. Most importantly, in her interactions with my friend. She can remember instances even as a young girl where her aunt would call her fat or tell her she's getting fat or call her dark incessantly as if she didn't know the color of her skin. Basically, she points out at any second she can something about this girl for no reason, leaving my friend to feel insecure the minute she sees her, when the reality is it's also the aunt that probably feels insecure the second she sees my friend. Something about their relationship has grown to be competitive in nature and extremely toxic, and her uncle, this aunt's husband, isn't any better. He's very misogynistic, and it plays out in his interactions with his kids and his wife constantly. And there's so many horrible experiences she's had with this aunt, but what's really important to this story is the fact that when she's brought up the issue to her mother just passes it off and says, you know her, that's just the way she is. She's always been that way because she's miserable, that she didn't get to have a career and do her own thing, and because we all know he, meaning her husband, cheats on her all the time, but she can't leave him because she doesn't have any money. Phew, I was not expecting this to become a tea spilling session, but I really need to get this point across that in our community, instead of seeing problems within each other and addressing it, we say, well, that's just the way so-and-so is. This behavior is problematic as fuck to me, and it always has been. Out of the 30 first cousins on my Puerto Rican side that I have, I only speak to a handful of them, even though I grew up having a relationship with all sorts of them. Because their parents have seen the issues within my family in regards to the emotional and verbal abuse my sisters and I endured at the hands of my father. And instead of either minding their fucking business completely or calling out the abuse, they decide instead to sit around and gossip about it and come up with theories that are consistently demonizing my mother and myself because
I'm not afraid to tell my parent when they're being an asshole. So, in our culture, it's considered to be huge disrespect to your parents to tell them when they're not being a good parent. So because I will never see eye to eye with these people, I just don't bother speaking to them because I don't see the point. Why should I need to force a relationship with people who clearly don't give a fuck about me and my well-being? Because we're what? Blood relatives? The reality is that I've decided to break that generational curse and assess my relationships on the basis of mutual respect, love, and communication. I don't care if we are related because I have friends that treated me more like family than my own extended family ever has. Friends who have listened to my story, who have cared for me and have cared about how they can treat me with respect, that the kind of respect that my family does not. And we have wonderful relationships. And what this has done is not only better my life and who I am as a person, but to be around people who help me grow instead of stunting my growth or being envious of it. It's also made my relationships with the few family members I do have one with even stronger because we have open dialogue about the toxicity and mental health issues that have continued to go ignored for so long to the point where it's robbed all of us of our childhoods altogether. And it's a beautiful thing to be blood related, to have those mental health issues run in your DNA and recognize it and make it a point every single day to be better and do better by others. To be a new generation of uncles and aunts that are loving, kind, protective of their nieces and nephews, and most importantly, people who recognize their own flaws and aren't afraid to embrace the idea that they can seek therapy if they need to in order to work toward a better quality of life. So I say all this to say that not only does being in a patriarch society make it difficult as a woman to function in a healthy manner within my own community, but being in a community that expects you to forsake your own well-being in order to hold strong to traditional mentalities, it's detrimental to the progress of yourself and the future generations we create of Hispanics. And what I'm trying to really drive home is that we don't have to live in the 1960s anymore in the South Bronx and in poverty. And with that being said, we have the opportunity to be greater than the last generation. We have the opportunity to recognize that it's perfectly normal and okay to seek help if we need it from licensed professionals. It's okay to take medication in order to be a functional human being. It's okay to decide that you don't want to live that way. And it's okay to cut off family members that have proven with their words and actions that they have no intentions in having a healthy relationship with themselves and with you. This is just one of the many social issues I felt like needed to be talked about within this podcast because it's something so prevalent in our culture and so deep rooted that so many of us aren't seeing this as a problem and should be, because we've been taught that, well, that's just the way so and so is. The fact that we bully and force each other into dealing with people because their family is honestly sad. Why do we do this? Why is this something that we have to be shamed into doing? Sometimes I look at other people's families and interactions and I see how beautiful and healthy they are, how they sincerely want what's best for the people sitting across from them at the dinner table. And because I don't feel like I got that genuine and sincere caring from family members as a kid, because I had family members that watched us be abused and heard about it and chose the side of our oppressor for the same sake of family, I strive to work on myself and for myself, but also for my niece and nephew so that they will never have to feel the way I do toward a large amount of my extended family. We as Hispanics have to do better about mental health in the family unit. We have to redefine our relationships with boundaries and with others. We have to take accountability in the spaces we occupy when we put words into the universe. Are the words helpful or hurtful? Am I being mature? Am I using my experiences to guide the younger generation in my family? Or am I using my age as a tool to keep young people silenced and forgotten and oppressed? These are things that more of us need to be thinking about. We need more titi mentors and tío leaders within our family unit, and less gossiping tíos and tías. This is truly how we actually mejora la raza, fix our own issues in order to fix the world from the inside out. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode, and as always, learn something new or walk away from this feeling validated and understood in relation to your upbringing or childhood. Thursday, do not miss it. We are going to be discussing how feminism is for white women, and you do not want to be a no-show for that one. So talk to you guys then. Bye.